Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
So I'm here with Dan Lawton today, and this is really exciting because we are actually crossing state lines. We are actually doing this interview. I'm here in Durham, North Carolina, and Dan is in New Orleans, Louisiana. And the reason that we have connected is that I'm teaching a class in New Orleans, and as part of my class, I love to bring in local guests and resources to connect the students to people and resources in their area. And I was so happy to stumble across Dan and his mindfulness classes. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here. Happy to connect.
So, I talk a lot in my health class about the importance of, I have my three M's. I have mind, mood, and mobility. And so I kind of talk about these as the areas where people are vulnerable when it comes to their health. And a lot of that is there are parts of that, I would say, that don't get as much attention as other parts. And mindfulness, stress, our emotional health, I think it's starting to get more attention and be recognized for the importance that it has, but we're still learning about it. I would love to hear a little bit about your journey and what brought you into mindfulness and a little explanation as far as what mindfulness is exactly.
Yeah. So maybe I'll take the second one first in terms of what is mindfulness. And so I think a good way to describe it is it's just a certain way of paying attention, which is distinctive to the way that we often pay attention. So we're practicing mindfulness. We're trying to pay attention to something on purpose. And that sounds really simple and obvious, but if you start to notice the way you pay attention to things throughout your day, a lot of times it's not purposeful attention. You're just getting like captured or swooped up somehow, right? Like this experience of you're going to the supermarket and you're going to the front counter and then suddenly you see this like chocolate bar and like you didn't intend to buy this chocolate bar, but suddenly it's in your hand. How did that happen, right? And so mindfulness is this idea of intentionally or purposefully focusing our awareness on something in the present moment experience. And then this other really powerful idea of non-judgmental awareness, which means we're not pushing anything away. We're not pulling anything closer. We're just noticing and just observing.
Mm.
And I got into the practice the same way that a lot of people do, that, it was just in my mid-20s and I was suffering a lot from anxiety and depression. And, it just was obvious to me that there weren't a lot of ways at the time where I could be kind of a participant in my own healing and my own shifts. And so I found this practice which allowed me to cultivate attention, to basically be able to keep my focus on something. And what that really shifted for me was I found that I was less likely to get caught in rumination and worry in a sort of cascade of negative thinking. And it was just such a change. It was just kind of like a parting of the clouds. So that's really what got me into practice. And from there, I just kind of continued to go deeper as I saw more and more fruits from practicing.
Just hearing your description of those things feels wonderful. I love the idea of having, avoiding that cascade of negative emotions and getting into like that positive, like clearing and opening in ourselves. So how long have you been practicing? Like what has been the journey for you?
Yeah, about 10 years now. And maybe 7 or 8 of those, I've been sitting a lot of long retreats, between like 5 days and up to 30 days. And so these have really been powerful experiences. I mean, they're challenging experiences. I think sometimes I come back from retreat and people, I think they think that I was like at a spa, for 30 days. It was really not like that, because you go into silence with your mind for extended periods of time and you see a lot of crazy stuff, a lot of crazy patterns of thinking that you have. And it's really challenging to spend that type of time by yourself. But when you do, you start to really learn what's happening in your mind and why you're seeing the world in a certain way. And you become deeply acquainted with a lot of your neuroses and anxieties and negative thoughts, and also your positive ones. You come out with a clear understanding of the way that you're filtering the world. And that can really save you from a lot of distress and lead to a lot of joy in life.
So how does being able to see our neurosis help us? Like I think that sounds a little scary to some people. So how do we experience that? And then how do we learn to work with it so that we're not left in that state?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to understand, right, is it's always affecting us or coloring our experience in some way, whether we see it or whether we don't see it, And so we have these things that are just kind of lurking beneath the conscious level of the mind, but they're really affecting and coloring the way we think about things. And so say we maybe have like a kind of standard neuroses that a lot of people have. There's just this idea that maybe we're not good enough, I'm not good enough. I never get things done, and I'm walking around with this idea all the time. And it's affecting and coloring everything that I see, right? But I don't even know that this is the way that I'm seeing the world. I'm seeing the world colored with these sort of negative glasses. So I become aware that this is a story that I have going, that I'm not good enough, or I'm not deserving of love, or I'm not a success. And then when I see this and I become aware of it, it no longer controls me, right? It just sort of sits on the periphery of my experience. There's an interesting, nice little quote that Ram Dass, a spiritual teacher, had about this. He said, your neuroses essentially become kind of like your pets in some way. So it's just like, oh yeah, there's my negative story, about how I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, or I'm being taken advantage of, or whatever. Once I become aware of that, I don't have to always react to that. I don't have to be dominated by it. I can just notice it, observe it, be aware of it, and then continue to move through my life, hopefully seeing things a little bit more clearly. And that's really a core idea in mindfulness practice, is that rarely are we seeing things clearly. We're kind of creating our own reality often. And so through this practice, we become more aware. What are my biases? What are the ways that I distort the world? And how can I get a clear picture of what's going on so I don't suffer as much?
So what, can anybody do this? Is there any requirement for doing mindfulness training like the one that you've done? And anybody do it?
Yeah.
Any?
Yeah, I mean, the practice is open to everyone, right? As long as you have a mind, you can learn to focus it, and so it can really span the gamut. I mean, you can just begin with a very simple practice of just focusing on something like your breath for 5 minutes, and it's just kind of like exercise in the sense that you're just building this muscle of having a concentrated, stable mind. And a lot of people will find and will be shocked at how hard it is actually to pay attention to something like the breath for 5 minutes, because the mind is just jumping from place to place, moving from place to place. And so, yeah, the practice is really accessible to everybody at different levels, but anybody can come in and anybody can do it, and then you can just kind of make it your own practice. And so some folks have a modest meditation practice of maybe 10 or 15 minutes a day, and they get extraordinary benefit out of it. But a lot of folks, once they start seeing the fruits of this type of practice, they find themselves wanting to do more. And one of the interesting and kind of paradoxical things about mindfulness practice is that, you're dedicating a significant amount of time to meditation, but you really get that back in your life because you start to see all the ways that you get distracted, pulled away, and lost, and so you develop a more focused mind, a more balanced mind, and a mind capable of seeing the world more clearly. So as you can imagine, the downstream implications of this type of mental training are so tremendously positive when it comes to our physical health, when it comes to how we handle stress, when it comes to interpersonal relationships, and just kind of how we're moving through the world.
So if somebody wanted to get started, can they do that on their own, or do they need to find a teacher, or is there something that you can tell us if we want to get started today that we could try on our own?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of this idea of just like finding, I don't know, easy wins or easy victories, And so what I would say is, like, if you're interested in mindfulness, if you have a smartphone, you could download an app. You could download two that I really like. One is 10% Happier, and one is called Headspace.
Okay.
You can download either of those two apps. It'd take you a minute to download them, and maybe then you just say, I'm going to do a meditation just for 1 minute, and you could just start with that. And I think one of the things that I'm aware of is a lot of people have this idea, I'm going to start a meditation practice, and I think it needs to be really ambitious. But so much of the challenge is just like starting the habit, So it's kind of like when I, at one point in my life when I wasn't going for the gym for a while, I would just try to like, let me just make it to the gym. Doesn't matter what I do, though. Let me just get through the front door. So what I would say is just download an app and see if you can do 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes a day. Really try to cultivate the habit of just taking some time for yourself to be in silence and to focus the mind on something. And then just let the practice move from there.
Yeah, I think we do have a tendency to focus on results, and we have that goal-oriented emphasis in our culture. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things with meditation is it's not always a linear progression, and the progress you're making isn't always visible or measurable, or at least not for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, this is such an important point, I think, because, what often happens when you start to meditate is you just become aware of how distracted you are. That's often the first insight that people have. And so a lot of times people will come to me and say, wow, I feel like I'm getting more distracted for meditation. But what's actually happening there is you're just starting to notice how often the mind is getting pulled away. And that's really a lot of what this practice is you just start to become aware of how frequently you get distracted. And then you learn to bring your attention back to the present moment with some level of kindness, not beating yourself up, right? But it's like, oh, I just got pulled away. I'm human. Now I'm coming back.
Yeah. Awesome. So what is the difference between mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, and other forms of meditation that people might find or encounter?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I mean, you could think of mindfulness as a style of meditation, just the way like maybe CrossFit is a style of exercise, right? And so there are other types of meditation out there. Another common one might be transcendental meditation that you might see. So mindfulness is just one style of practice, and it's a style that comes directly out of Buddhism, and the origin is a word in Pali, in the Pali language, called sati. And so it's become, though, a very, definitely the most common form of practice in the US. And I think because, it really makes sense to a lot of people. I mean, there's nothing exotic that you have to do to practice mindfulness. We don't have to bring in, objects or anything like that. And it can be a practice that can be done along with sort of rituals or different sort of religious or spiritual ideas, or it can be done in a very secular context, where you just have the practice and nothing else. So, yeah, I mean, the distinction there is just the different styles, but mindfulness is the style of practice that I think has really taken off in the West because of its effectiveness, because we're always in a place, right, where we have things like our breath or the sensations of our body or sounds, which are some of our common objects for meditation and mindfulness. We don't need to bring anything else in. And the core idea with the mindfulness practice is not so much that you have a certain state change, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you get relaxed or blissed out or something like this. We're really trying to create a trait change in the mind. So I can bring this type of curious present moment experience to anything that happens in my life, good or bad. And I think that's another reason why this type of meditation has become so powerful, because the end goal is to integrate it into your day-to-day life. So you don't just have 1 minute of mindfulness, but mindfulness is, interspliced in your entire life.
I mean, I think just hearing you talking about this and is really like, I feel relaxed. It's like, it just feels, just hearing the words is like, oh yeah, there's a different way to think about it. I do think it was really important that you said that mindfulness is something that can be practiced either within a certain spiritual context or in a secular one. So even though it has a Buddhist history, it sounds like, it can be brought into any spiritual. It's not required to be Buddhist to practice or use it as a tool, right?
Yeah, no, that's totally correct. And so the curriculum that I teach, Mindfulness Based Stress Reduction, was created by a fellow named John Kabat-Zinn about 40 years ago, just because he was aware of this specific issue, that there are so many people who would never practice mindfulness simply because they thought it was affiliated with religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs or maybe even cultural beliefs at the time that they didn't identify with. And his idea wasn't that those spiritual practices weren't worthwhile, but they weren't necessary in the sense that they would be impediments to people coming into this practice. There's nothing particularly Buddhist about just being aware of breathing or being aware of your body. And so the work that he did was really taking the meat of these practices, the mindfulness practices, and then bringing them into a modern, secular, context in which folks from all walks of life could explore these practices. And this is an idea that I really resonate with, because having spent a good amount of time practicing in the Buddhist context, there's a lot there that I really love, but there's also a lot of places to get stuck. There's a lot of contradictory ideas. There's a lot of rituals. There's a lot of cultural ideas. And so, for me, these secular maps of practice have been really important in understanding the practice and bringing it into my life.
Mm-hmm. So, when I come down, or when I'm teaching the class down in New Orleans, you were going to come and share your gifts with our class. But if there are other people who would like to find you or learn from you or take a class with you, how could they do that?
Yeah, you could go to my website, which is NOLA Mindfulness. It's fairly easy to remember. NOLA, like New Orleans, Louisiana, and the word mindfulness.
Right.
And there's a number of different things that I offer there. I mean, you could sign up for my email list. The most substantial offering is the 8-week course in Mindfulness Based Stress Reduction. But also I have a drop-in group called Meditation Lab that meets once a week that anybody can come to. I often teach half days, which are 3 or 4 hour sessions, maybe once a month, that are open to everybody. And then also I do work sometimes for like organizations and groups that hire me to do a workshop. So there's lots of different opportunities for practice. And, you can just also go on there. And if you have questions about practice, you're welcome to shoot me an email and help you out. What I also have on there that I think is really helpful is a list to a number of different sitting groups, meditation sitting groups in New Orleans, because it's really hard to do this practice on your own, So to have some type of accountability measure, some type of community that you can connect with is really valuable. And so that's another resource I can connect folks with.
So out of all of those things, if somebody is a beginner, if they've never done it before and they want to just come and have a taste of what it would be like to have a mindfulness practice, where would they feel most comfortable if they just wanted to kind of come in for the first time?
Yeah, I would say to come to the meditation lab, which meets once a week. It's open to everybody. And the nice thing about it there is you'll get a taste of practice, but also you'll connect with a lot of other folks who are doing these practices, and they'll be at all different levels of experience. And I think this is tremendously helpful, to meet somebody who maybe started meditating 2 months ago, and then to meet somebody who started meditating 2 years ago. And to see that the problems that they're facing in practice are a little bit different, but there's a lot of commonality and a lot of overlap. So that would be my suggestion of where folks could start their journey if they're interested in practice.
And when does that take place, the meditation lab?
Yeah, it's every Sunday evening from 6:45 to 8.
6:45 to 8. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I know that I certainly have a lot of students who are trying to find ways to manage stress. Like there's fears that can come up around aging. There's, concerns around health or finances. And then, of course, caregiving. So I work a lot with caregivers, people who are working, who are caring for someone who has dementia and just feeling really, really exhausted and tired and depleted. And I think that having a practice like this, even though it can be new and maybe feel a little uncomfortable, it can really give back to us and replenish us and give us energy, give us clarity, help us be more creative. There can be so many benefits to it. And then we can bring that to all of our relationships so much. Is there any particular story that you'd like to share, either for yourself or for one of your students, where you really saw, wow, I just experienced something completely different way, and I know I can credit that to my meditation practice, my mindfulness practice?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of different things that come to mind. I think the most powerful, this is just one testimonial or one experience, but it follows a similar theme. You know, one of the things that we really focus on in these classes is understanding the relationship between your thoughts and the sensations in your body, right? And this is kind of really common in the sense that, let's say there's something that you're anxious about, right? Well, how do you know you're anxious about it? Often it's because you feel there's some butterflies in the stomach, or there's some tightness in the chest, or there's some constriction in the jaw. And oftentimes then we feel these unpleasant sensations and they make us even more anxious. You know, it's like, oh God, now I'm anxious about my anxiety. And I had one guy who was in my class, and his job was, he worked as I think a city planner or a city engineer. And this often involved him being up in front of large groups of people. And a lot of times they were frustrated about a certain project that was going on, you know, and it really was rarely his decision to sort of do the project or not do the project. He was just there implementing it. And he would talk a lot about the distress, you know, of just feeling this experience. A core idea in this practice is that when we have unpleasant sensations in the body, instead of trying to push them away, we actually turn into them and become interested and curious about them, which feels so counterintuitive, right? And so he was working with this in a practice we use called the body scan, where we're bringing awareness to our body. And then he was describing later in the class how it wasn't that these negative sensations went away. He still felt them when he was up in front of the town at these various meetings, but his capacity to meet this experience was radically changed. It was no longer a problem for him. He knew that he could just be there, noticing the tension, the tightness, the sensations. And this is this phenomenon called decoupling that we spend a lot of energy and practice on, you know, just to stop this kind of toxic fusion that happens when our anxious thoughts create sensations of anxiety, which create more anxious thoughts. So I just share this because I think it really, I don't know, I think it illustrates a core idea in practice that can be such a radical paradigm shift. We don't have to be afraid of our anxiety anymore and try to push it away or bury it or suppress it, right? And at the end of the day, we don't really need to be able to harness an extraordinary amount of willpower. If there's just a willingness to meet the present moment experience, and we start to learn that we're actually way more resilient than we think that we are, that we can be with a lot of pretty intense experiences. But the mindfulness practice is just the training that lets us know that, you know, and then like our day-to-day life, that's, for lack of a better term, the sort of the game, you know, that we're training for.
Well, thank you so much for that. This has been an amazing, you're just amazing speaker. You've been able to handle these, like explain these really complex topics in such a wonderful way.
Thank you.
I don't have to say anything. So thank you so much for sharing your time with me. And I can't wait to come down and have the class experience. You guide us through an actual exercise together. It's going to be so fabulous for all of us, I know. So yes, if you are interested in learning more about Dan Lawton in New Orleans, please do visit nolamindfulness.com, and the class that he mentioned that would be great for you if you just want to take a first step in this direction would be the meditation lab, which takes place on Sunday evenings from 6:45 to 8 o'clock. Thank you so much, Dan, for being here, and yeah, peace out.
Yeah, thanks. It was really enjoyable. I loved it.
Okay.